Thank you. And now it's your choice whether you want to continue on camera or not. If you can stay on camera, we would love that. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. A warm welcome to everyone. I guess good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. So we'd like to thank you for joining this important conversation on leadership and governance. We are delighted to co-host this session, and I'll be doing that with Rebecca. And today we'll seek to explore what it means to prioritize equity and accountability in governance systems today. And so we are privileged to have two exceptional speakers with us. Jill Zamenovitz, Chair of Save the Children Canada, joining from Toronto, and Janet Mawio from Galvanizing Africa and the RINGO Project, connecting from Nairobi. Their wealth of experience and insights are going to guide us through an important exploration of transformative governance. So I hope we're all excited and anticipating a really interesting session. So today we are seeking to address a key issue. Traditional governance models often lack the equity, shared power, and accountability needed to tackle the challenges of our very turbulent times. So with this session, what we are seeking to do is to explore practical pathways for change, focusing on innovative approaches that can actually drive positive transformation. So we'll start by unpacking the challenges, and then we'll also highlight on inspiring examples of what's possible. So it's not just going to be about, us meeting and talking and having a nice conversation, but it's also going to be a call to action. So together we'll discuss governance models, both formal and informal, that prioritize equity and shared power. So today we encourage you all, everyone on this call, to share stories from your own experiences, real life examples of governance challenges, and how they are successfully addressed. Your contributions will make this dialogue richer and more actionable. So I'm hoping to see a lot of activity in the chat box area. So let us make this an engaging, solutions-focused discussion. And just to say, we're really thankful that you are here with us today. So just a couple of logistical announcements. Before we begin, please note that this Zoom room will stay open for 30 minutes after the session for informal conversations, because we recognize that, yes, we're going to have a very interesting 1 hour of conversations, but there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot happening. And so you are welcome to stay and share what's on your mind. My colleague Rebecca and Deborah will facilitate those conversations. And please note that we won't be able to provide translation for this informal conversation. However, in the spirit of community, if any of you can help with translation, please feel free to step in when we move into that session. So let's get started. So, like I said, we have two very interesting and amazing speakers with us today, Janet and Jill. Janet from Galvanizing Africa and a colleague at the RINGO Project, and Jill, the board chair of Save the Children Canada. So I'll start this whole conversation by, asking Janet. Janet, from your experience, and from all the work that you've done, we are eager to hear your thoughts on transforming leadership, particularly the critical changes needed in board and executive leadership to shift power. So Janet, if you could share a bit of your thoughts on this.
Thank you, Charles, and everyone. Really nice to be here and glad we are taking an interest on this very critical conversation. I actually am a believer that a lot of things that happen to us in organizations begin and end with the leadership, and the board is a major part of that. And as I was thinking about the session today, I actually remembered how my very first experiences with meeting boards. And it went back to a time when I worked for an international organization, and we used to do a lot of board assessments for the partners we were working with. And some of the things that we used to find a lot were boards that were created around the time of registration, because that was a requirement. And so the ED would be the one who has picked people, brought them up, and usually the ED is also the one who does the fundraising and organizes the NGO. So because of that, most board members would be thinking about the ED as their boss, as opposed to the ED being accountable to them for the work they are doing. We also encountered lots of boards that had been there for long, not serious transitions. And one of the other things we also saw was picking people because of the image they brought to the organization, even if they did not have time. I remember several times being told, oh, we have so-and-so because they are a good name to have when we go to government or even in our website and things like that. So, I found some of these conversations very, a bit disturbing sometimes, because I then realized that actually many boards were not really were not quite in a position to take up their roles because they did not fully understand it. And for the organizations who seemed to see there's a problem, they would actually ask for money to do some board trainings or things like that. But then when I myself started running an organization, I had really the best chance to understand much more, not just being interrogative because I'm trying to assess somebody for funding, but I actually had to live it myself. And I remember in the case of the organization I was running, Kenya Community Development Foundation. When you go back to even the formation, it was actually the people who believed in what the foundation wanted to do, wanting to shift the way development was being done. People who had been in the space and were fed up, and they actually wanted to bring on board people who saw that they need to do something differently. And I remember, it was the same group that, continued to lead. And that helped me know that actually I began to experience the idea of being accountable to a board. And, as the organization got established, we did set up committees. And from committees, that was the first place where the board would have a chance to interrogate different things that were happening. Even if you take the program committee, for example, deep conversations around how the programs were being implemented, the interaction with communities, conversations around which money we were taking or which money we were not taking, or even money we were considering. That group had a chance to really delve into greater details. So I actually learned that looking at the skills that you are bringing on board when you are choosing board members is a very important thing. And it allows you to put everybody in the committee, whether audit, finance, governance, in the place they are best able to bring out their skills. I also saw that I also realized that the issue, we actually spent time just even defining what were the things we were looking for. And I remember integrity was a major thing. And this was at a time when there was a lot of all sorts of stories. Harambe is a term which talks about collecting money and putting it in a project. There are some people who are known for not being very honest because they had mismanaged money that had been collected. And so the board put an issue like integrity as a major thing, including if you were in politics, you could not get into the board. So actually just discussing in detail, what are those things that you must have for you to qualify to get into this board, putting a very clear scrutiny method. And if a name was suggested and you know, a doubt was cast on anyone, that was the end of the name. It would be put aside. So I began to experience what it means to really have very clear criteria, looking at the kind of experience people are bringing onto the board. And then that actually set the tone for management. Even in our own conversation with me as the leader of the management team, we knew there were things that could not pass the board because we knew the board was the boss. So I think my learning was that a board which is in control has to be one that sets the example. It actually lives it themselves, and they set a tone for everyone else. And when you get it right at that point, it makes it easier for you to proceed. And we knew we were accountable. And I remember us sitting sometimes to analyze the different questions, different members tend to bring. And so after a while, you actually get to know your members very well because you know the things you must preempt even before they come to the meeting. So one of the things I also found useful in terms of also growing the board myself as the lead in a small team was just field exposure, giving them a chance to go to the field maybe once or twice in a year, going to partners meeting once in a while. If a meeting was happening in a location where there was one or two board members, would encourage the board member to go there because this gave the board members a chance to have a real strong understanding of the work that we were doing at management. And also having complete transparency, because I also realized it's very easy in our context, at least, to be selective about the kind of things that you bring to the board. So if you don't want to be very transparent and the board is not really on top of its agenda, you can be selective, and that can create a problem, especially when some serious issues come onto the fore. And one of the things I found useful for me as an ED is actually to have a very strong human resource department, because we then needed to keep track of many details, how long we had a particular board member, what were the skills, what were we lacking, so that next time when we are looking for somebody, we know what to look for. So for me, these were just simple things that I found very, very critical. And I realized that you also, as management or as a team, have to invest in the continuous growth of your board if you really want them to continue doing a good job. But still, I think there are some areas that even when I now look back, and I was in that role for almost 17 years, so I had a lot of chance to really continue learning to work with the board, learning transitions, how to do effective transitions, continuity. And in fact, one of the things I should not forget to say is that I actually realized a good board becomes the holder of the DNA of the organization. You may have changes within management, but if the board doesn't really know what do we really stand for, you stand a chance of losing it with time. So I found it was so important to continue getting aligned people, to continue building on who we really were as a team. Just because in the interest of time, a few things that as I was reflecting about the conversation today, things that I found I needed to continue working on, and maybe I would throw them as questions for you, is the question of diversity, because I remember coming from a country which has many tribes and, you know, different places. We really worked hard to continue being diverse. But the question I continued to ask was, how do we ensure anybody who comes in is actually able to contribute? Because they are well prepared, they understand what they are meeting, they understand what we are about. In diversity, of course, these days we talk a lot about whether it's youth or women or people from a particular region or something. But I found a challenge that one has to continue working on is, how do you ensure that is happening? And sometimes I've asked myself, are there other ways of ensuring voices are heard at board level without necessarily insisting that a particular group must be at the core team of the board? So it's a question, but it's something I wrestled with. Another one I wrestled with was transitions. What are effective transitions? And I remember in my context, and when we think about growing an African organization that doesn't have a big block of money from anyone, it means you have to actually find some ways of keeping the organization running. And sometimes in 3 years, somebody is just beginning to settle. And maybe if you say it is 3 years and then you change 3 years, or even if you make it 6 years, for example, I actually found some of that is very challenging. It is not, it's limiting. It may not give enough time because, for example, in our case, we had to really work at finding other income streams. And it took a while for a board member to be able to take leadership on matters like those. So sometimes I wonder, is it contextual? What are good transitions? And the DNA thing I also talked about, I also realized when there's a weakness at the board level, you can end up picking money, which actually dilutes your DNA if you are not really showing leadership. So when you talk about shifting power, if this is not right at the board and moving outward, then you stand a big risk. And I found it's one of those things that can be challenging, especially now that you must also keep finding people to change. Lastly, volunteering is something that we promote, and it's a great thing. And sometimes I've asked, what does that actually mean? Especially when you want experienced people, maybe who are not tied to whatever. What does that mean in the particular context that we are in? So I would ask, what else have we found effective in keeping board members motivated so that they really give the time that is required? They really take serious thinking about the organization for its survival and continue to push forward. So Charles, I think I'll stop there. I think time is running out.
Thank you so much, Janet. A lot of insights and a lot of questions for all of us to think about. I think the thing that for me, I remember very from what you just said is about the fact that the board represents the DNA of that organization. And that if you want to shift power, you have to ask yourself whether the board has the right representation, the right culture to be able to do this. And it's not every single resource that is a resource that the organization should be pursuing. So that's very, very, very insightful. Thank you so much, Janet, for that. So Jill, you are currently a board chair of Save the Children. So it would be great to get, from your perspective, first of all, what motivated you to take up this role? And some of us, of course, have read about some of the work that you're doing, and you because you participated in the board action board, you also talked about how you say the board has tried to tackle issues like structural racism, so that you can actually effectively shift power. We'd love to hear your experiences on the Save the Children board.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you, Janet. I really enjoyed your remarks as well and was taking my own notes from what you were saying. As Charles mentioned, I'm joining from Toronto. The land that I'm on is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Métis, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. So, how did I come to this? I have to say, so I am chair of the board, but in my non-volunteer life, I'm also the CEO of a national not-for-profit in Canada. So I really do see this from both sides, from the board side and the management side. And of course, in my day job, I'm also managing a board of directors. I came to it not out of any wish, but because of an acute incident involving structural racism within the organization. And so it sort of pushed everybody to a very difficult part. And at the time, I was the vice chair, and they were asking me to step into the chair role. And all I could see was this massive mess that I knew nothing about. And so I was reluctant to take it on, thinking that this was going to be the topic of the next 4 years while I was chair, but also that it was a topic that I didn't know a lot about. So I went to them and I said, I would love to be chair of this board. I absolutely support all of the work, but I will need training. So, and I really approached it in the same way as if the organization was, let's say, in a financial crisis. And I went to them and said, listen, I am happy to be your chair, but I need financial training. I need to understand how to read your balance sheets, your P&L, those sorts of things. And there was sort of this pause because honestly, that resource was not as readily available than if I had been asking for legal training or HR training or finance training. And that's how I got connected with Ringo and with um, the amazing smaller group that has been focused on actual board action. So I'll say that first, it's not easy to find these resources. I needed to start with doing the work myself and was very supported by Rebecca in doing that. And then, so I did this deep dive and I sort of read and read and read. And I'm not saying I'm there, but I did do some work on my own awareness. And then I came out of that. And then I said, I remember to Rebecca, okay, I think I've worked on myself, Rebecca. I'm ready. Can you just give me the playbook on how now I apply this in my board? And so she sort of, gently explained to me that there may not be a how-to for boards in terms of following best practices on how you dismantle structural racism. So that is sort of the journey that I have been on. And at that point, I realized not only was there no playbook, but I also reflected that it was very, very easy for boards to move away from this work. So even though there was this acute incident in my organization, which I think overall does help to focus the board on this issue, even then, the next thing that came along, they were I won't say we were extremely quick to leave structural racism to the side and to focus on what I would call a more concrete issues. And I would say, and I'm glad that Rebecca started by recognizing what has happened in the United States and how the defunding of US aid is affecting our organizations around the world. This is a perfect example of how a focus on this topic is difficult in times where there look like more obvious things for the organization to focus on. So unless you have a deliberate commitment to that, it's very easy to move away. I can share a couple of things that I found effective. I don't know if we are sort of there, but I think there were two things first that we needed to recognize. And so I will say, when I did my own internal deep dive, there were a whole bunch of things that I needed to recognize. And so I was working on that. But then applying that framework, I found that as a board, it was equally important for us to say, not only individually do your own work, but as a board, what are our biases? And the two things that really came through from our work was, first of all, the incredible passion of board members. And that is wonderful and amazing. And I know that every single person on this call has experienced that. The issue is, though, when that passion gets in the way of doing things in the right way, because you are trying to achieve those results. And I know that's not always, it's not always popular to say, oh, tamp down that passion. But we do sometimes need to recognize that achieving results may need to be lessened in order to uphold the principles of dismantling structural racism. And of course, in an ideal world, like, people will say, but don't use but, use and. You can do both. And I believe you can do both, but I also think boards need to be open to the fact that sometimes that passion does work against you achieving your KPIs. That was the first thing. The second thing was the tendency to control the wrong things. So that our board members often come from corporate backgrounds where there are very, very clear KPIs on how much you're going to raise, what you're going to spend it on. And one of the ways to achieve those things is to hold that control. And what that means is by, I think, not dismantling structural racism. So those were the two things we sort of had to recognize and come to as a board. And I'm not saying every board has those issues, but that was certainly in our case. And then we had to really sit down and think about how are we going to fix those tendencies with some actual structural things. And so a couple things I can just share, and then I'm happy to go into examples from our own programs and what we did, but I'll just throw these out there. So as Janet said, deliberate recruitment, and that has to be not for diversity, but for dismantling structural racism. And I think what I've seen for a long time, and I've sat on one other international board in the early 2000s, as well as a number of Canadian boards, is the notion that diversity equals dismantling structural racism. And those are very different. So, as Janet said, having the conversations about DNA, about how we approach things, and really in those board interviews and in that recruitment process and in your skills matrix, looking at who holds that knowledge. And again, very different from just having a diverse board. The second thing is, of course, training on structural racism. So the whole power to rather than power over, recognizing the passion and control tendencies. And so, okay, so that's the second one. Third one is agendas. So making sure, and I know this gets really operational, but making sure that agendas have a space for dismantling structural racism. We don't think twice about having a space for governance. We don't think twice about having a space for finance. We don't think twice of having a space for our risk registries. Why are we not carving this out as a space for our agendas? And it was only when we actually mandated that it came up. Because I have to say, when you have 2 hours and you think, oh, we'll maybe just put it on there, guess what always gets knocked off, particularly when you're in a situation where the majority of your funding is about to go away. So agendas was important. And then measurement. And I'm happy to talk about this further, but really how we structure the KPIs in the key performance indicators in our strategic plan that drives behaviors from staff and from the board. And that has been, I think, a real game changer in terms of that accountability piece for the board. Having an enabler in our strategic plan, which is to shift power and strategic partnerships, and then talking about what that actually means. So in actual percentage ways, that has been really important. I think what the one thing that I want to work on further is, other than those KPIs, how do we know at the board level when we have achieved some of these things? So what are the types of conversations? What are the words? What is the cultural humility behavior that we will see around the board table that will say, like we've introduced these measures and I can see how we are moving along the spectrum. Because that for me is very important. And it's not as measurable as things like finance or legal. But I think if there was a recognized, standard that my board was working to, that would be very beneficial. So I'll just leave it at that, but I'm happy to give specific examples of what we've done, or to share anything that we have developed.
Thank you so much, Jill. Thank you. That's amazing insights there. Certain things caught my attention. Passion should not get in the way of doing the right things. I love that. The tendency for the board to control the wrong things, and the fact that diversity does not necessarily equal dismantling structural racism, which is absolutely true. And the fact that it's important to get our board members in a certain mental space and a certain knowledge about what structural racism is. So the whole idea of training in a very systematic way. And I think the last thing that you said before you signed off was, how do we then track progress or track the milestones when it comes to whether we are achieving the objectives when it comes to dismantling structural racism, because it's not very simple to measure. So thank you so much, Jill. So I just want to ask both of you a question before we kind of open it up for a couple of other people to share. And it's related to what you said, Jill, and also what you said, Janet, about ensuring that there's equity in governance and decision making. There are a lot of people probably on this call who maybe have just been called up onto a board, and maybe are even, going to play the roles of board chairs. Or maybe they are members of a board that have just begun a journey of trying to do some governance transformation. So it would be great, Janet, if you could share some really practical examples of how to go about this. What should they be looking out for? What should they practically do to shift power?
Yeah, thank you, Charles. First, I am one of the people who believe that it's not enough for you to select me to join your board. I need to be able to say whether I am going to join the board or not. Because I realize that when you join a board and you actually don't share in this values, in the way of doing things, in the seriousness in which people take the commitment, you actually get frustrated because it's like you're caught up there. So I always feel it's important that you yourself, before you join a board, you actually evaluate, try and find out as much as possible what they stand for, how things are done. Because I've also seen situations where boards will meet and talk, but there are decisions made elsewhere. So I think it's important, even you yourself, you get a fit with any board that you're joining so that you confirm that you really share things in common in terms of your concerns, in terms of the difference you want to make. And I think it's important to also, as a board, come up with, just good governance practices and be willing to assess yourselves. I found it very valuable to actually, I found it very valuable, let me say that. I found it very valuable to actually do board assessments every year, where as a team, we actually look at various parameters and check, how are we performing? What evidence is there to show that actually things are moving in the direction? So when we think about equity or even how it translates in the way we do things, one needs those kind of eyes. And sometimes just an external eye to look at your own documents, your own policies, may be one way in which somebody can pick up. I think in this area, this doesn't look like it speaks to what the values you're talking about, as well as on the ground. Just at different times, finding an external eye to help you look at how are you doing what you're doing. I found that very, very valuable. And that's why I realized it's important that boards don't remain somewhere up at the top, but are completely disconnected with the work, because even they're joining a field trip, they're joining a meeting, they're joining an external forum, even external conferences sometimes help board members wake up to, oh, maybe we are not doing this. So benchmarking was always a very valuable thing. And I remember the meetings in Canada were one of the favorite ones that we used to find, just going to meetings and checking how are other people doing, because it always pushes you to not stay in your comfort zone, but actually check what are other people doing, which is likely to improve the way you are functioning. So don't sit comfortable. I found that useful. Don't be comfortable with yourselves, but always try and keep learning, keep benchmarking with others. And where possible, get an external eye for someone to either look at your internal documents, to see whether even among your staff, sometimes there's racism, for example, practice within the way we deal with staff in countries in particular. You'll find there are different things happening than what we say at head office. So someone needs to be able to pick those things and also creating an open culture. Yes. Creating a culture where we can give feedback to each other. That's very important. If you don't have a very good culture, then of course you get away with something that may not be good, because anyway, you have not learned to be truthful. So trust is important, and being truthful with one another. I believe you grow together as a board, and every time you find an area that needs correction, you face it and correct, and you're not ashamed, because we are all a work in progress. We can all get better. So it's always good to get an external view of how we are doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Janet. There's an interesting question, Jill, I would like to just direct your way. First of all, I mean, two questions. There's a question from a colleague about, what were the KPIs that you developed to address structural racism? And then there's also a question, and yes, that was by our colleague Sabina. And then there's also a question from Tanya about how you tackle INGO boards that have a systemic, discomfort with or deeply held perception that supporting locally led development or shifting power is inherently risky, right? And so it challenges their risk tolerance. It would be great if you can just share just briefly on those two perspectives.
Absolutely. So I can share the KPI and I'll put it in the chat as well. But the outcome is so the enabler is to shift power and strategic partnerships. The outcome is to develop more programming through principle-based partnerships that incorporates collaboration and equitable decision making with partners. So that is sort of the outcome. And then how we measure it is from the perception of the partner. So it's the percentage of partners who report that their organization and Save the Children Canada are working together in an equal partnership. So that's a self-report, but not by SCC. It's a self-report by the partner. I would say other KPIs, though, come through senior leadership team and CEO management. So there is actually a competency part of the CEO review that includes this cultural humility portion. And so that is also sort of a way to metric. I was going to say on the perspective of advice to board members. So I mentor a lot of, through another organization, young women board members. And that's always the question. Like, so when I go into the interview and then at the end of the interview, they say, do you have any questions for us? What should I ask at that point to show I'm really interested? And so I think it would be a great benchmark, for us doing this work. And I am always so thrilled when I hear this question is, how is your organization working on dismantling structural racism? So you'll hear a lot about localization, but what are you actually doing? Asking if it's a KPI in the strat plan, asking for examples on how that's actually being done. I love that question. The other thing that I think is a great question because I think in raising this topic, we do need to recognize, and this goes to your second question of how do you work with boards that feel that that sort of control is not there, is to ask as a new board member or an interviewing board member, give me an example of the last time your board dealt with a real conflict. So you don't have to tell me what the conflict was, but explain how that was handled by the chair, how people were allowed to or not allowed to speak. And I find it super interesting when that question cannot be easily answered, particularly where the person can't remember when the last time there was conflict. Because if that is the case, then regardless of how it's dealt with, the right issues, and I would suggest, but that's just because I'm thinking a lot about dismantling structural racism, is not something that's coming forward probably at the board level. And it needs to be. So in terms of if it is in the DNA, as Janet said, that will come out as something the board's dealing with. So I would suggest those as questions. On the issue of a board that wants to control the wrong things. So the biggest example for me is our Indigenous Child Rights Program, in which we have really done a lot of work on shifting power, and that the project design, the donors who we partner with is very, very, very recipient led by the local Indigenous organizations. And I find I can visibly see the board's discomfort when we get reporting on this because they feel like we're not tracking the same metrics as we are internationally. Also, ask that question, how come we can do it with our Indigenous rights programs, but we're not there yet with our international programs, which is a whole other issue. But I think then once we actually share with the board what the control mechanisms are, they actually come away feeling quite comfortable. So I don't know if it's because we're not as good at articulating them. And again, it's very much not having control, but making sure that you're in control of the right things. And these are perfect examples of places where, as an organization like Save the Children Canada, we can specifically empower local Indigenous communities that don't have the access to funding that we do. And then once the board hears that, their whole passion kind of shifts to that. And that's when you get the really great discussions and I think the actual change in the DNA.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. I think this was an amazing, amazing conversation. So thank you so much, Janet, and thank you so much, Jill. So many insights and the chat. I can't even follow. It's busy. It's busy. A lot of experiences being shared there, and we will respond to all these when we put together our report and this and share. But this is amazing. So I just want to invite Rebecca to just keep the conversation going. Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Charles. Thank you, Janet and Jill. We are aware that so many people sitting in the audience here have their own stories to tell about what's worked and what they're trying out. And you know, when we worked with something called the Board Action Pod in Ringo, the big request from people was, please share case studies. Tell us what's working. We need sources of inspiration. We need to know. We're worried about trying things out on our own without any examples to fall back on and any sources of inspiration. And so this is just an acknowledgement that many people in the room have examples to share. And please, if you have an example of transformation in governance and leadership, please put a link in the chat if that's been written up somewhere so that we can make sure that that information is shared. We are just going to mention one example that we're aware of, and this has been well written about. And this is about Help Age International having adopted a localization agenda as part of its 2030 vision. And in that context, all of its national offices have been going through a process of becoming locally owned. And for those of you who were part of a Ringo Spotlight session a few months ago, you would have heard Dr. Hein, who's now the CEO of Age in Myanmar, in conversation with Bert, who is head of transformation in Help Age International. And we've got Bert here on the call in the Zoom room. We've got Robin Talbot here, who's on the board of Help Age International. And Hein had hoped to be able to talk to us, but he's traveling at the moment and his internet is so bad, he's tried to join several times and he keeps getting kicked off. So we won't go into further detail just yet, but I just wanted to introduce you to, if you're interested in finding out more from these people, let's also spotlight Bert and just so that you can be seen, you can wave. I'm so sorry we don't have the chance to hear your story, but if people are curious, please direct message Bert or Robin and ask them for links to places where they have written about this, or invite them to tea with your board and help get the stories out. So thank you so much to you, the two of you, Bert and Robin, and in your absence, Hein, and to everybody else in the Zoom room who has stories to share. Again, please share your stories. They are gold for people who are facing the same questions that you faced. So with that, I will hand back to you, Charles, to share a couple more resources and links and to close us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you. So I just want to share some exciting news. Ringo is in its third phase, and we are taking a direction that is building on the work that we've done in the first two phases. And so with this phase, we are trying to amplify the voices of the majority world. And so there's going to be a lot of regional community building, and that means we're going to have a lot of conversations happening in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and in Africa. So the focus is on strengthening these regional networks, promoting decolonization, and supporting the Shift the Power movement to inspire long-term change. We're also going to be sharing more widely and more strategically Ringo's knowledge and practices that we've built up over the first two phases. We've created or are, developing a resource hub, and that's going to help with our advocacy. And I know my colleagues will share Ringo's new website, which will be used as that resource hub. And then we are also going to help the prototypes grow with funding, resources, and spaces for experimentation and learning. And so the Ringo innovations, we're going to find different ways of supporting these innovations. So basically, the thrust of phase 3 is to seeks to place the majority world at the forefront of a reimagined global civil society. So a lot more of the South-South kind of conversations that has been missing from this body of work. And so this is what we're going to be doing in terms of Ringo moving forward. And we'll want all of you to be part of this process, and we'll be getting in touch with everyone to connect and to learn and to share and to move forward in the work that we are doing. And so just to close, which is sad because this conversation is an amazing, was really amazing. I just want us to, sit back, and reflect on all the conversation that we've had. And when you think about shifting power in leadership and governance, right? When you think about shifting power in leadership and governance, which weather symbol best describes where we are right now in February 2025, right? With everything that is happening globally, like the USAID funding freeze and its impact on organizations, on governments, does it feel sunny, cloudy, stormy, or something else, right? So I would want everyone to pick a tick, the symbol, the tick, and put it where it best describes your feeling. I don't know if Sparkle, you want to kind of give us some direction on how to actually pick up these ticks.
Sure, it looks like lots of people are doing it already. If you navigate your mouse over to the left-hand side where you can see there's like a toolbar, the top one, if you click select, then you should be able to grab onto a tick and move it over to find put it over the weather that you think best represents how you're feeling about leadership and governance at the moment through the lens of like shifting power. See lots of ticks already coming up.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't look very sunny, which is sad. Where I come from, it's sunny all the time. But yes, that's understandable. It's definitely a lot of cloudy weather, thunderstorms, definitely, droughts, dark clouds, windy. Oh, okay. Sun and rain, right? So we have a mixed bag. Oh, we even have some tornadoes, a typhoon. Yeah. So we have a mixed bag of weather. And these are very, very turbulent times. So we're going to have some thunderstorms, definitely. probably one typhoon, a couple of tornadoes. But the sun will rise and the rain shall fall. Yeah. Thank you so much for showing this. Yeah. But before we go, I would love to bring back our guests, our speakers. The conversation was so rich, so I just want to ask one more question to each speaker. What will be your top two pieces of advice, to all of us on this call in terms of what boards and leadership should be doing to shift power in these very, very turbulent times? Your top two pieces of advice. So I'll start with Jill.
I guess I would just say institutionalize it, like put the structures in place that will allow you to get there. Because, like, the quote is something about we don't rise to our aspirations, we fall to our structure. And I think if it's not in the structure, it's really easy for it to go away. So that's what I would say.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jill. Institutionalize it. Thank you so much. Janet.
I honestly believe a lot starts and ends with us as board members. And because we set the tone for management and for our teams, I think it's really important that we just rise up and do the right thing. If we really believe there's need to shift power, let's just get on with it. And if we don't know enough about our organizations, let's dirty our hands and understand what's actually happening on the ground, so that we begin to engage on what are practical things we can do on the ground with communities, with our partners, which show we really are acting what we are saying, so that we stop the talk and do the action.
Thank you so much, Janet. I love that. Get up and get on with it. Rise to the occasion, and basically dirty your hands. Get to know your organization more intimately and do the work. Thank you so much, Janet. And thank you so much, Jill. We really appreciate your insights and your experiences that you've shared. And thanks to everyone on this call for participating and for sharing and for contributing. So Rebecca, take us forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charles.